Let's go ahead and begin this morning. Open up a word of prayer. Lord, we thank you for the day and thank you for the time now that we have to come and to look at your word, to see how your word that we have in our hands is its history and how it's come about and how we can rely upon it and trust it. We ask you, Lord, to attend to our conversation and guide our understanding this morning. Give us insight into these things that we look at, and give us a heart that trusts wholly in what you have given us in your word. We pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, we're on Old Testament transmission of the text from the original writings. We began last week to look at the history, and we made it up to discussion of the Dead Sea Scrolls. A key, and we'll probably mention this a few times this morning, but the significance of the Dead Sea Scrolls is that before 1947, the oldest text we had of the Old Testament was called the Aleppo Codex, and that's dated around 900 A.D. But when they found the Dead Sea Scrolls over in the caves at Qumran, it took us back in textual history to the time of Christ, and we saw that there was a great deal of reliability or similarities when comparing the text. So that gives us a great deal of confidence that the Masoretic text, and you'll sometimes see that in your Bibles in a footnote with a capital M, capital T. If you ever see that, that's what it's talking about. We have a great deal of confidence that this Masoretic text that these scribes made down through the centuries is a reliable text. So, we live in a great time. I mean, for Bible manuscripts. I mean, you can't compare what we have to what early Christians have. Even if you go back to the time of the Reformation, the early translations of the Bible into English, the number of manuscripts they had was so small, far less. We are probably more confident today than we ever have been in the texts that we have, that are the original, the closest that we have to the originals of the text. So it's a great time to be alive in terms of manuscripts, biblical manuscripts. All right, we want to look at a few witnesses of the Old Testament. We've mentioned the ones about the Dead Sea Scrolls. Somebody asked me last week about the number of manuscripts we have. Well, here's a slide. We have over 3,000 Hebrew manuscripts of the Old Testament. There's 8,000 manuscripts of the Latin Vulgate, which is an early translation. 1,500 manuscripts of the Septuagint, also before the time of Christ, that was translated. And then 65 copies of the Syriac Peshitta, which is simply the Old Testament in a dialect of Eastern Aramaic. So that was also an early translation of the Old Testament. So those are the number of manuscripts. You see, that's a good number of manuscripts that we have to compare, to seek to find what the original most likely would have said. Let's go through a few of these. These are some of the oldest ones that we have. Cairo Codex contains the latter and former prophets. It's date 895. Codex of Prophets, which is housed in Leningrad, 916, contains Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and 12 minor prophets. This is a key one we'll talk about in a minute, Codex Leningradensis. It contains all the Old Testament books. It's the earliest complete manuscript that we have, dated around 1000 A.D. We just mentioned Aleppo Codex. It was the oldest complete manuscript until some of it was partially burned in a fire. That might have happened, it might have been World War II. I'm not exactly sure when that happened. British Museum Codex. We got part of the Pentateuch here.
around 950. Reculin Codex of the Prophets in Germany, around 1105, Latter and Former Prophets. So we have a good deal of early manuscript evidence of the prophets. And then, of course, the Dead Sea Scrolls, our earliest copies, date back to the time of Christ and contain really all of the fragments of all of the books of the Old Testament except for Esther that we looked at. All right, these two are key. The Old Testament, well, let me put it this way, the critical editions, and when I say critical, I'm not being negative. I'm just saying that critical means it's a examined, compared edition. The Old Testament Hebrew text I showed you last week is Biblical Hebraica Studengardensia. And there's another one, I think the last word is Quinta. And those are just, in the New Testament, slightly different. The Old Testament, they have relied upon one codex here. And it's Codex Leningrandensis. It's, like I said, it's the oldest complete copy of the Masoretic text, dated to AD 1008. When we get to the New Testament, you'll see that they've taken all the manuscripts, compared them, and sought to put together from all these manuscripts what they feel most plausible is the original. Now, the Hebrew text, they've basically taken this text here and used that as a critical text, even though they know there are some errors in this codex. But since I think it goes to show that since the reliability of these Masoretic texts are so high, they feel they could do that. It was just as easy to do that as it was to seek and pull out a passage. Now, in your Bibles, you'll still see notes that say Dead Sea Scrolls say this, or Septuagint LXX, might say this. So some of your translations will give you some indications of where they might differ. The Masoretic text might differ with, the Dead Sea Scrolls. So that's the basis for these two versions of the critical Hebrew text. The Alpo Codex, as we mentioned, is the oldest incomplete copy of the Masoretic text. And 1/4 of this manuscript was destroyed by fire. But since it is a Masoretic text, approximately the same time period, it's very similar to this one. And the Hebrew University Bible Project uses this manuscript as their text, or as their base, when they do put together a critical text. So those are the key two when it comes to the modern Hebrew versions of the Old Testament that are used. And we've already talked about the Dead Sea Scrolls. I don't know why I kept putting slides in here. I guess I was fired up about how important this was. But these do agree with the Masoretic text. All right, we have some other manuscript witnesses we have. Really, one more Hebrew witness, and this is Samaritan Pentateuch. Some of these copies were written in the Paleo-Hebrew script. Now, you remember when the kingdoms were divided after the time of Solomon, you had the southern and the northern kingdom. Well, Samaritans sort of put together their own version of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And some feel, now you got to be careful because there's some places that it's different from, say, the Dead Sea Scrolls or the Masoretic text. Some people think it might be a theological thing because, of course, they had a different place to go worship, a different place, a different style. They pretty much came up with their own version of worship when they split into a northern kingdom. So you got to watch out for some theological interpretations added to that text. But it's still important since it's early in its writing. We mentioned the Septuagint, early, pre-Christ, pre-time of Christ translation into Greek. 3 of our New Testament codices that we'll talk about when we get to the New Testament also contain a copy of the Septuagint. So we do have some early copies of this to evaluate as well. As mentioned before, this was when you see a quotation in the New Testament from the Old, more than likely it's going to be a quote from the Septuagint, because that's what the people understood, that's what the writers understood. At that time, the knowledge of Hebrew had drifted away since the time of the exile and the return, and then the time of the Greeks and the Romans taking over the nation. So a lot of people understood Greek more so than Hebrew. Aramaic targums simply were commentaries on the Old Testament in the Aramaic language, but usually if you read commentaries, there are verses. When a person gives a commentary on a verse, they'll actually write the verse in the commentary. So that's also helpful when you compare the translations of the verses themselves in these commentaries to what is found in the other texts. So these are some other witnesses we can look at to compare, to seek to come to original writing of the Old Testament books. This is the oldest fragment that we have of the Old Testament. This is a silver amulet that was found in the Scottish Church, Old Scottish Church in Jerusalem. Is where it was located. It's dated to the mid-7th century BC, and it contains number 62426. That might be the Shema, and it's written in Paleo-Hebrew script. It probably doesn't show up as well as I hope, but the script is that initial pre-exile script that we talked about, and how the language or the alphabet changed after the people came back from Babylon into a square script. This is the translations in the square script. But that's the oldest fragment that we have of the Old Testament. And 7th century BC, Numbers, originally written around 1400, 1500, so you're talking, you still got 700 years there. This is a Nash papyrus. Contains some of the Decalogue in Exodus 20. Just showing you a few examples of some of these manuscripts that are not showing up as well as I wanted. This is a page from the Codex Leningrandensis. You'll notice how they go down in columns here. That's usually what they did. I should go this way, right to left. You read it, and also zooming right to left on the page. So, neat handwriting. I'm assuming if you could read Hebrew.
Like a top to bottom.
Yeah, top to bottom. Yeah, you just start here and you read that line and you drop down and then you come over here. All right, here's where we are. This is sort of a complete translation history of the Old Testament. Is that clear or not? All right, at the top, you remember we talked about the 4 eras of scribes that existed from the time of Christ up through about 1000 AD. These are the key scribes that were responsible for maintaining this Old Testament text, the critical steps that they took in counting letters, counting verses, counting words, to make sure that when they made a copy that it was just like the original that they were copying. So they are responsible for the confidence that we can have in these texts that even are dated long after the original's written. You got primary translations. These are the Dead Sea Scrolls here. These are the Aramaic Targums dated from the 2nd to the 5th century AD. And this is Cairo Geniza. Y'all remember me talking last week about how the scribes would take these old scrolls when they were past their usefulness, and they would store them until eventually, when they had enough stored up, they'd have a ceremonial or ritual burying of these scrolls. Well, this is one of those locations where the room that they'd stored the scrolls, they forgot about it, or something happened and it was enclosed, and then later on they found these scrolls just sitting there. So you imagine the excitement on those archaeologists and paleontologists, I'm not going to say it right, the ones who study ancient writings, when they found those scrolls. So they were meant to be destroyed, but they've been saved. Good thing for us. All right, here are some of the witnesses we have. The silver amulet there, dated 700 BC. You have the Masoretic text, which I think the form was formed around 250, 200 BC is when that actual form of the manuscript came about, and is the copies that we have that has been brought forward. You have the Samaritan Pentateuch, slightly before the time of Christ, the Septuagint. This, refers to how these scribes up here put forth all this effort to make sure that these copies were the same that they were making. This is when that emphasis on to be exact came about, and that's about the time of Christ. So we can be confident that the Old Testament we read today is the Old Testament that Jesus quoted from, that Jesus knew about when in his time period. That's the version that he had. Origen's Hexapla is, I think, the Old Testament in 5 different languages. So Origen put it together. These are 3 key codexes for the New Testament, but they also contain the Septuagint. And then these are some that we've already discussed as well. You see, the Greeks sort of got, I don't know, upset or irritated when the Christians sort of took the Septuagint and ran with it as their version of the Old Testament. So some of the Jews began to make other Greek translations of the Old Testament. And these are those. You have the Syriac versions, the Latin versions, originally Old Latin and eventually Latin Vulgate, Coptic versions, later versions, Ethiopian, Armenian, and Arabic. So all these are, before 1000 AD, the Bible is being translated into these other versions. So it does help with comparing manuscripts. Although some of these versions were probably translated from the Septuagint. So you've got sort of a double translation. So the more translations you get away from the original, you're going to run into more and more things to look out for, mistakes or translation errors that are made. So, that's key. When the Reformers said back to the originals, they wanted to go back to the Hebrew, because the early Christians, they had put so much emphasis on the Septuagint. That was, I mentioned last week that when Jerome translated the Latin Vulgate, he did use the Hebrew, and Augustine was irritated. He said, you got to use the Septuagint to translate into the Latin. Because you remember when the Greek language sort of began to fade away in the Western Church, because Latin took over. The Romans and the language of the Romans began to become the majority language, and only Greek was spoken around in the Eastern Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church around Constantine, and that's also will be critical when we get to the New Testament manuscripts, and why we have so many copies of New Testament manuscripts that are from that area of Byzantine. All right, just a summary there of where we've come so far, timeline. All right, why do we need textual criticism? Why does it exist? Well, even though the scribes who copied were professionals and they went through rigorous training followed strict rules, there's still the possibility of errors creeping into the text each time it's copied. Now, I'm sure we could hand out a piece of paper to each one of us in here, just be focusing as hard as you wanted to on copying that paper. I guarantee you, no doubt, there's going to be mistakes. Just simple copy mistakes as you look down on the paper, and it just happens. So we can classify these changes or errors into unintentional changes and intentional changes. All right, these are some of the common types of unintentional changes, and basically these are just spelling or just simple copyist errors. We'll look at a few of them. Haplography is a singular entry of a letter which should have been written twice. So you have a word with the letters that has a double letters, spell, S-P-E-L-L, got two L's in it. This error would involve omitting one of those L's. Now, have you ever done that? You ever see two letters in the middle of a word and you're making a copy of it, and your eyes move from the original to what you're writing? You know, it'd be nice, I guess, if we could do like a frog and have eyes on both of the copies, the one you're copying and the one you're writing, but we can't do that. Our eyes move back and forth. So a lot of these errors come from that. Dittoography is the opposite of that, writing twice what should have been written once, whether it's a word or a letter. That's an easy thing to do. Metathesis, transposing of letters or words. I don't know if you do that. I do that typing all the time. I get going and I type I put AD in. I transpose these letters. And I'm sure if I can do that with a typewriter or a computer, then these guys can do it when they're writing as well. Fusion, combining all or parts of two words into a single word. Again, as you look back and forth, you're trying to be careful, but still you get confused. Fission, division of a single word into two words. And we're talking about the Hebrew language, and some of these letters are very similar. I don't know, we probably went too fast when we looked at the alphabet, but there's some letters that are almost identical, except for just as Jesus called a jot or a tittle on the top of one of these letters. And so you can, if you know the language, you might be less likely to make those errors. But still, if someone was sloppy in the copy you have on a certain letter, then you might get confused as well. Homophony, substitution of one homonym for another. Sometimes the words have similar meanings. So if a scribe, is going through and he sees that word in his mind, he might think of another word that means the exact same thing in his language. So he writes the word that he is more familiar with. Okay, these are some other ones you'll hear about. I'm not going to pronounce that one. Omission of an intervening passage due to have a similar ending such as between two sentences. Say you're reading down a column of text, and at the end of these two lines, it's got the same word. It's a common word. So you come to the end of the first line, you see the end that word, you finish copying it, and you look back over, and your eyes, instead of going to the line you just copied, drops down to the line that has the same word on the end of it. So you skip it. So you've actually skipped a whole line of text. That's an error that can happen as well. This one is the omission of an intervening passage from the beginning of two similar sentences. Again, in this case, the beginning of the sentence had similar words, and you would skip it because you would think you'd already copied it. Vowel misreadings. I can see these two, especially in the Hebrew language. Misreading vowel letters as consonants and vowel point variations. Misreading a weak vowel as an actual consonant, or discrepancy in added vowel points. These are just, since some of the Hebrew letters are similar, you're gonna run into that too. So these are what any copyist combats unintentional errors. Nobody's got a conspiracy here trying to make a difference. But the key thing is that on rare occasions, that one letter can make a big difference in the meaning of the word and in the meaning of the text, so what it means. So that's, when we talk about the percentage of that happening, we're well under 1%, if that high. So, but it still is there. That possibility is there. All right, unintentional changes in the Hebrew text. These are changes that a scribe would intentionally do. They would sometimes change of rare or unusual passages or usages of words. This is another one where they would use a different word for a similar item. They just had two words that meant the same thing, except this would be an intentional change instead of an unintentional one. Euphemistic changes, make it sound a little better than it was. Maybe the scribe had a slant towards one thing. Additions or glosses. These are simply commentary that is added to the text. One manuscript says the word flood is explained by water upon the earth. So he's given a definition of what flood is. Instead of writing it to the side, he's putting it into the text itself. So that's an intentional change. You're not trying to change anything. He's trying to be helpful. But he really needs to add those things outside of the text. Modernizations, you got grammatical, spelling, and pronunciation. Language changes as time progresses. Just look at our English language. And so a scribe of around 1000 AD might, our early on scribes might have made changes to update based on these changes in the language. Sometimes in the Old Testament you'll run across a name or a city that probably didn't exist at the time that original text was written. I think he in Exodus talks about Ramses, city of Ramses. Well, if you go by a conservative date of the Exodus, Ramses is long after the Exodus. So more than likely, a copyist at his time, that city called Ramses was called Ramses. He knew if he wrote the original name of the city, nobody who read it knew what he was talking about or where he was talking about. So he substituted the name Ramses, city of Ramses, into the text. You'll see that with cities common, as also names sometimes might be common. Just trying to be helpful again and trying to let people understand what they're talking about. And then also an intentional is a suppression of incorrect readings. In Codex Vaticanus, there was a incorrect. This verse is left out because the scribe felt that was not the correct reading, so he left it out of the text. So now, of course, that is a Septuagint copy of the Old Testament. So those are some intentional changes. It's a lot different from what we'll hear some of these critics say, how there was a widespread conspiracies. More so you hear about that in the New Testament, but even, they might go back to the Old Testament some, but these are just changes, intentional changes that were made to help the readers understand the text. All right, we see textual criticism. We've mentioned before, it's art and science that seeks to determine the most plausible original reading of the text. This is where it, kind of gets interesting and exciting. If you like detective stuff, that's what you're doing here. You must examine the evidence and then reach a conclusion. We'll just look at a few of the steps here of what happens. Usually in the Old Testament, especially, you seek to find a common starting. And in the Old Testament, that's the Masoretic text. It's a reliable tradition, and this is the text they want to start with. And then they compare all other texts to it. You got the original text, and from that, came our Hebrew copies, and then our ancient translations that also came from the original. When we're looking at the most accurate Masoretic text, these are probably in order, the most accurate ones that we can rely upon. They go from some of the earliest down to others as well. And then when we have that Masoretic text we feel is the most reliable, that's when you move to these other copies of the text and other translations. Your primary sources in Hebrew, of course, will be these earlier ones, especially Dead Sea Scrolls, but these other manuscripts they have. And then you get into your secondary sources, Samaritan Pentateuch, Greek versions of the Old Testament. Probably these are in order of importance, which ones to rely upon. So they look at all these and they compare them to the Masoretic text and see how close they match up. Once you have all these sources, again, you determine what may be the most plausible reading, and this includes evaluating what they call internal evidence and external evidence. Internal evidence simply includes spelling and other changes related to the structure of the text itself. So it's what you read. When you refer to internal evidence, it's what's in the text you have. You look at the errors, the mistakes, the vowel changes, the intentional changes, literary construction. Now, external change evidence relates to those items outside of the text. For instance, what is the language of the witness? Hebrew texts are considered primary. What is the date of the witness? Earlier texts are most often closer to the originals. The older it is, closer it is to the original. Reliability of the manuscript, textual tradition, and number of errors it's contained. The Masoretic text is considered a tradition. It's been carried forward. How does that compare to the Dead Sea Scrolls as a tradition? Provenance, the origin or source. We mentioned the Samaritan Pentateuch. Good changes have been made based on differences in how they choose to worship. When they read how God told the Israelites to worship, and then they started basically their own kingdom. They started their own religion. What changes did they have to make the Old Testament now fit what they wanted to do? And then we mentioned this earlier, the interdependence of the witnesses. The witnesses' dependence on the other. Since the Septuagint was early, many translations into other languages depended on the Septuagint instead of the Hebrew. So instead of just a single translation from the original language, we've now got two translations. You get into some areas of the more translations you move away from the original, it's getting harder and harder to do, to find out if it is reliable, if that translation is reliable. You got, something. Those who hold to a King James only version of the New Testament, if you read the King James English translation, there is no single Greek text that reads like the King James in the New Testament reads. But some guy a few years ago, he made one. So he went from the King James English version and he translated it back to Greek and claims that is, the inspired Greek translation or Greek version of the New Testament. Of course, no manuscript we have reads even close to what he came up with. So you can get in some problems as you move further away. So he went from Greek to an English translation. Now he made this English translation back into Greek. So you got to watch out for that when you're evaluating these translations. All right, these are probably the order of importance, the quality of the Old Testament witnesses. First off, we've got our base point, the Masoretic text, Silver Amulet, Qumran manuscripts, Dead Sea Scrolls, other Hebrew manuscripts, and then your Samaritan Pentateuch and then your first Septuagint is really the first translation in order of importance, and they move down from there. All right, these are some basic principles. If you don't remember anything about textual criticism, these are key. Now, I know this, you might be getting bored at this point. You either like this or you don't. But these are some things to remember. Manuscripts must be weighed and not counted. All right, so what does that mean? Just because a reading may have a lot of witnesses, what is its weight? Older manuscripts would generally carry more weight than a more recent one, since it is closer to the original. Weight is determined by age, accuracy, and a manuscript's relationship to other manuscripts. If you had now New Testament, it's easier to see, but say you had 100 manuscripts dated, 1500 A.D., but you only had 10 manuscripts dated, say around 1000 A.D., and that's a 500-year difference. And we notice some. I don't think in the Old Testament it's the case, but say there were some differences in those two. Well, just because you got 100 manuscripts of one particular version, it's not going to necessarily be the most reliable because it's older, or it's more further away from the originals. So usually, this is just a general rule, but more than likely, usually, the older the manuscript is, the more reliable it is. It's closer to the original. It's been copied less times, which means there's been less opportunity for errors to creep in. Now, does that make sense to you guys? I mean, fortunately we have the original of the Declaration of Independence, but just imagine if it gets copied over time. Would you want a copy around 1800 or would you want a copy around 1900? Put it in that perspective. I want one closer to when it was written. And that's what some of these textual critics do. They weigh it. And weight is a lot of weight is given to age, how old it is. And of course, they are able to determine age by the writing. These guys are almost dead on accurate. They're consistent. When they look at a writing in a text, they're able to determine how old that text is. All right, second point, you determine which readings would most likely give rise to the others. As you look at a reading and you see how it's might have changed, you can sort of follow the path back to where that change most likely took place in the tradition of the manuscripts. The most distinct reading is usually preferable. Another way to say that, I guess, is the hardest reading is most likely preferable, because a scribe would have a tendency to make a reading easier to read than harder. He would make it read so he could understand it. If a scribe came across a passage that he didn't understand it, he would have a more tendency to make it easier. So when you got two manuscripts, and this one's a harder reading and this one's an easier reading, you probably be more likely to trust the harder reading as being original, because it would scribes aren't going to make anything harder to read. They're going to make it easier. So if he made any change at all, he would go in that direction. Okay, does that make sense? All right, the shorter reading is generally favored. A scribe would be more likely to add to the text than to take away from it, such as a clarifying note or explanation, which is called a gloss. So when you've got two manuscripts you're comparing, one has a shorter reading, one has a longer reading, and you'll see this in the New Testament too. More than likely, the shorter reading is the preferred reading. It's the original reading. Scribes rarely took away from the text, but they would add to it to clarify it, sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally. As we said earlier with the definition of the flood, they were just trying to help out the readers. So now again, some of our fellow Christians who hold to the King James only version will accuse textual critics of taking away from the text, pulling verses out of the text. But that's not usually what happens when a scribe works. A scribe usually going to add to it and not take away from it, especially when the scribes here had such a reverence for the Word of God. They're not going to want to pull anything out. Notice last week how they always added these notes to the text that they had, and so they'd write it to the side when they had questions about it instead of just marking it out of the text completely. All right, the next one, determine which reading is most appropriate to the context. This is the actual step in determining what reading is most likely the correct one through examining literary structure, grammatical or spelling errors, and historical context. So we get to the point here now where they've evaluated all this evidence, they've looked at all these manuscripts, and now they make a decision as to which text is to be regarded as the original or the nearest approximation to it. These are some quotes from Paul Wegner's article in the ESV Study Bible. Although some textual puzzles remain and those scholars still differ among themselves in how they weigh some of the evidence, careful application of these principles allows a high level of confidence that close access to the original text does indeed exist. If you look at footnotes in your English Old Testament, I'm talking about your more modern translations, you're going to find that these variants affect far less than 1% of the words of the English text. And even among that 1%, there are no variants that would change any point of doctrine. So, again, if you don't remember anything else, remember that. You look through your Old Testament, if you've got a reference Bible, you'll see these footnotes. They'll make comments in the margins or at the bottom about a verse you might have a question about. But since the Old Testament, is 3/4 of our Bible, so there's a lot of words here, and we're talking less than 1% that we're having any concerns about, and that none of them affect our doctrine. That's a high degree of confidence in what we have. He concludes that while some places remain where it is hard to be sure of the original reading, as a general assessment, it's safe to say that the Old Testament text that is the basis of modern English translations is remarkably trustworthy. So in relationship to the Old Testament, we can have a high degree of confidence that it's a trustworthy translation of what the originals most likely would have said. I can't sit here and say what we have is what the original said. But I'm trying to give you that when you can weigh all this out, you can have high confidence in what you have, and what is taught in terms of doctrine is what was there. Good. All right, we'll finish Old Testament. We'll move on to New Testament next week, and hopefully take 2 weeks to get through it. But you get into a slightly different area. The transmission is slightly different. Wasn't done by, quote, professionals. So a lot of critics attack our New Testament. So we'll look at some of that. Well, let's go ahead and close in prayer. Lord, we do thank you, as we've heard, that your word is from you, that you have preserved it, and you have given it to us. And I pray, Lord, that we will be people of the book that seek to use it as our rule for our lives and our doctrine. We will, as Stephen said, not worship the book itself, but we will worship the one who is its author. We thank you for this day that you've given us. As we gather to worship you, we ask you to enter now. Come down and meet with us as we enter into worship. And may you be glorified in all that is said and done.